Hi, and welcome to another Bible study. Today we are looking at Genesis 12 and 13, and this is where we finally move from these big stories about the people in the world to the family, specifically of Abram. And so we're looking at Abram's moment with God and then the journey to Canaan, and then what begins to happen. He's faithful, he's not, all of the different things that begin to pile up of dynamics between family members, because Abram and his nephew Lot are not going to have a good situation that they're going to have to deal with. And how do they begin to deal with that? So looking at Genesis 12 and 13, the author is the Yahwehist author, and this is characterized by the name Yahweh being used in the text. And the purpose of Jay's writing is to justify the political and social realities of the Israelite monarchy in the time of King David and King Solomon. And it often, that writer's work, it focuses on the repeated human trial and failures that happen, like just repeated once and again. And often the human attempt to play God, and of course the inevitable failures that come from that. The J writers are around the early monarch period, so King David, King Solomon, so 10th to 9th century BCE. When we're looking at chapter 12, the word Shechem means slope, and it's mostly derived from the geographical location of the city being on the side of the mountain. And then Sarai means princess, queen, woman of noble or royal birth, which is really interesting because she isn't always treated that way, even by Abram. And then geography-wise, we're looking at, they arrive in Shechem, one of the oldest Canaanite cities. It's located on the hill of Canaan on the pass between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. So we are looking at that area there where it's kind of situated currently, right, in current day Israel. Also in the regions we're looking at anything south of Syria and north of Egypt. We're going to be in that kind of general location for a while. Some interesting things to note about chapter 12. Verse 1 does represent the first appearance of God since Yahweh scattered humanity at the end of the Tower of Babel in chapter 11, verse 9. Verses 1 through 3, God would take the initiative rather than responding to the errant behavior of humans. God takes the responsibility for providing for someone with a name, in contrast to humanity's attempt to make a name for themselves. So God's like, okay, I'm now going to take care of you, and here's who I'm taking care of, instead of humanity just kind of going off and doing what it's going to do. And then verse 2, we've got offers a promise that Abram will become part of the world. Verses 1 through 3 are pivotal as they are transitional texts between the complete primeval history and of family literature. Abram's becoming a blessing is inherently relational. It depends upon him receiving blessings from others. So it is not an isolation kind of story of, well, just these things are going to be heaped upon Abram, but in fact, it's how Abram is going to live with others and whether or not there will be blessings. Verse 3 emphasizes that blessing over curse. Verses 4 through 9 is family literature is interested in the ways that families come to exist, as well as in ways that they separate. So there's both in this story of coming together and separation. Verse 5 reports that Abram leaves for Canaan. He's depicted as continuing the journey his father had begun, and that it's in obedience to Yahweh, and expecting some further indication of where he was to stop and dwell. Verse 6, he enters the land of Canaan. Verse 7 suggests that Yahweh's appearance to Abram as soon as he has arrived in Canaan is an indication that Abram has arrived at the promised place. In verse 8, Abram pitches his tent between Bethel and Ai, and where he invokes the name of Yahweh. He's doing something distinct with building new altars and worshiping in places that are altogether new. At Shechem, God reveals to Abram for the first time that this is the land of Abram and his descendants that they will eventually possess. In chapter 12, verses 10 through 20, Abram tells Sarai in Egypt, so this is now we're moving actually out of the land of Canaan, because supposedly there is drought, there's famine. And so Abram's like, okay, we got to leave this place that God said was ours. And so he takes Sarai and his family into Egypt, and he tells Sarai, who's his wife, to say that you are my sister. So this is the first wife-sister story, and it foreshadows the plagues that Yahweh will use against Egypt. Abram speaks for the first time, and his first time speaking, it's not great. Abram instructs Sarai to claim they are siblings so that he offers his wife as a ransom to save his own life. Yeah, not a good look for Abram. Sarah is taken by Pharaoh, and she loses her identity as an Israelite and as Abram's wife. When she is referred to as the woman, she becomes an object. So again, this story isn't going well. Abram offers 2 reasons for his plan, which so often, right? Sometimes we get a plan in our head and we have terrible reasoning for it. So Abram's reasoning is, 1, that it may go well with him, not anybody else. He's just very concerned about himself. And 2, that he might remain alive. Doesn't care about anybody else. So he is now on the path of, I'm only paying attention to self. So Abram is now only concerned with his prosperity and his survival and the problems that causes, which is a really good lesson for us to remember, because so often that is the way it happens. When one becomes so consumed with their own prosperity and survival, it can absolutely hurt and damage others. And then when Pharaoh discovers that Sarah is Abram's wife, not his sister, he is shocked. Abram played such a deceitful trick on him. He is not happy. And in verses 17 through 20, Sarah regains her name and identity because she retains the status in the eyes of God. So Yahweh enters the narrative on behalf of Sarai, because Abram doesn't care at all. And so now God's like, I need you to care. Like, this is ridiculous. And Pharaoh asked Abram 3 questions. What have you done? And then the second and third question probe for Abram's rationale. Like, why? Like, why did you do it? And those are good questions for us of going, and how many times have we, when we have felt wronged, have we asked, what has happened? Why? Why has this happened? And then as we move out of that story, some things to note when looking into chapter 13 is that by this point, they've returned to the land of Canaan. And this is where Abram and Lot have to negotiate that Abram's wealth, which seems to be connected to the dishonesty he exhibited while in Egypt, while he was pawning off his wife, it proved to be a profitable venture for himself. Wealth became a result of Abram's deceit rather than God's favor. And that's really important, because some people are like, oh, God must be blessing them more because they have more money. No. Here, this is all about recognizing, actually, Abram's wealth comes from being deceitful and has nothing to do with God, which is really important for us to be able to recognize. And that also, this great fortune that he has evaporates. It is gone by the 3rd generation. His grandson, Jacob, is going to have to work for the dowry for his wives. Like, it's gone. All of it is gone. The wealth accumulated by one generation is squandered by the next. And then this story is significant between Abram and Lot, because one is that the conflict that emerges between Abram and Lot, like, to recognize that conflict emerges between family members, and that the implications of of the resolution for both of them are going to require that they move in different directions, that they take a different path from one another. And in this passage, it's almost like Abram learned from his mistakes, maybe in Egypt. And so he actually shows up in chapter 13 as being a more hospitable person. And verses 2 through 4 characterize Abram as wealthy, and that it's kind of like this character, like, all right, he's on a very different path, where Lot, also in chapter 5, has a lot of wealth, but it's different from Abram. And so it's kind of an interesting thing about what they have, what they do not have, and just kind of they're having two different, even though they're family and they've been traveling together, that they're beginning to show different sets of characteristics. So thinking about that, not to get totally focused on the wealth part, but recognizing that they have different characteristics about how they are leading and living their lives. Verse 6, we find out that the land cannot support them, and that the number of their livestock is too large for the territory where they are located. And then that the number of animals and shepherds actually make it impossible for them to exist peacefully. Like, they're angry at each other, like, my sheep can't eat while yours are eating. And so to recognize that something that starts as, oh, it's good to be together, that now the land can't support them and now they are fighting. So it's interesting what begins to divide and push families, push relationships apart. Verse 7, it's both ecological problems and those of human interaction make conflict inevitable. And so it's kind of one of those things. Well, then how do we respond to the conflict? And in verses 8 through 13, before the conflict becomes worse, Abram takes action. And so it's at the beginning of the conflict. Abram's like, we got to figure this out. And Abram offers, as you're reading through this, Abram offers to Lot, says, you pick where you want to go and I will take the other. And it's interesting how Lot makes his decision, because this is going to come back to bite him. So Lot's decision, it's grounded in kind of this moment of looking at, ooh, this land is amazing, and it's supposed to elicit like thinking back to the Garden of Eden, to the lushness of Egypt. And Lot cares nothing, like it's like the bright, shiny new penny that Lot is after. That, oh, this is the best, and that's what I'm going to take, not realizing that he's going to put himself in a really interesting predicament with the people of that area. And we get the conflict resolved between Abram and Lot as they choose to separate. Like, okay, we're going to have to go live over here. You're going to have to go live over there. And that there becomes peace then between the families. So it's interesting how sometimes we have to metaphorically move to new places, new understandings, so that peace can be achieved. And where Lot pitches his tents, where he makes his place, is near Sodom. And it's not known, even at the time of Lot, it's not a positive thing. It's known as a place of wicked and populated by people who are sinful and who are against Yahweh. Whereas Abram moves closer to the Canaanites and the Perizzites. With verses 14 through 18, we can understand that as being characterized as an epilogue, and that God makes a dual promise of giving Abram land and the understanding of you will have descendants. That it kind of is this promise that goes throughout. Like we hear it again with Isaac, we're going to hear it again with Jacob. So what are some things that the text is trying to convey? Well, chapter 12, the call of Abraham becomes the call of all who choose to follow God. All who are to follow God must leave their old life behind and follow towards a new creation. So it's kind of like, all right, we got to change. And sometimes metaphorically, we have to change places. And then because Abram obeys, God promises to make him, not Sarai, a great nation, blessing him and making his name so famous that future generations will use it as a blessing. The patriarch is promised possession of property plus a prolific progeny, but for God's promise to be fulfilled, two obstacles must be overcome. First, Sarai is barren and advanced in age, and second, the land that is promised is already occupied. By building an altar, the first within the promised land where Yahweh is to be worshipped, Abram is replacing the local deities with his. Verses 10 through 20 is trying to convey that the telling of the wife-sister story focuses on the dissonance between Abram's plan and that of God. Abram's plan is designed to save his life and to gain wealth, and God's plan is on the other side, is concerned with restoring Sarai to her status as Abram's wife. Abram's plan threatens his ability to have the promised children that God had promised. And then it also is trying to convey that Abram hides behind a lie. Not only does he betray his wife, he is revealed for lacking integrity. He fearfully lies concerning his wife, lacking faith in a God who will safeguard him so that the promise given can be fulfilled. He sells his wife for riches rather than rely on God to provide for his needs. Abram may have lacked faith, but Pharaoh did not. So that's something kind of interesting that the text is conveying. Chapter 13, what it's trying to convey, after wandering in Egypt away from the promise, away from the responsibility of walking in the ways of God, he returns to his original commitments to God. So that sense of always being able to return to God. And that even though Abram failed to demonstrate the ways of God while in Egypt, God still renewed the promise first made when he entered Canaan. And then it's also trying to convey that it's ensuring that Abram's offspring is understood as inheriting the territory of what will become Judah and Israel, land to the west of the Jordan and the Dead Sea. The story also highlights Abram as a strategic thinker, one who can even be understood as gracious to his nephew. The narrative represents Abram as a wealthy individual, someone able to move throughout the land from Bethel and Ai to Hebron without difficulty. So there's a freedom element to Abram when Abram decides to follow God. And the story of parting ways also serves to show the different people linked by similar culture and language, how they came to occupy the land with Moab and Ammon, Lot's descendants east of the Jordan River, and Israel, Abraham's descendants, are west of the river. Problems that the text there's no clear answer for. Like, you may be going, some of this stuff is weird in this text, and what are the things about that? So there's no clear answer for this. So in chapter 12, contrary to the promise given in the previous verses that God would bless those who bless Abram and curse those who curse Abram, 12:3, Pharaoh was actually cursed after blessing Abram. Pharaoh blessed Abram with riches, and unbeknownst to him, Abram sold him property with unclear title. When Abram said, "This is my sister," instead of my wife, even though it was Abram who was faithless, it was Pharaoh who God cursed with severe plagues. Abram's acts complicate, if not brings into question the divine promise. And how does that work? One may bless Abram and yet be cursed. Like, how is that actually working? So it's something to sit and wrestle with and to kind of come back again and again and question it. Well, what does this mean? And how does this work? And it doesn't mean that when we have questions about the text that we're able to easily solve them. Why does any of this matter today? Well, chapter 12, here are the things that we should be thinking about. What are the things we are following? Like every day. Like, what are we following? Who are we following? What are the messages we are following? And then how are we navigating this journey of life, especially when things get really stressful? When maybe we find ourselves between a rock and a hard place, how are we navigating then? Are we more into protecting ourselves with little care for others? And how often do we get ourselves in worse situations when we insist on doing things our way instead of God's way. And so those are the things we can be taking from chapter 12. What we can take from chapter 13 is, what are we willing to do, to give up, to let go of, so that we have more peace for ourselves and with others? How do we navigate those complicated family dynamics? I hope that this has been helpful. I hope you, as you are reading through, you can come back and listen again. As you gain questions, may you have questions about this text. May you hear something that resonates with our lives, with your life today. May your day be blessed. Have a good one.